to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 58 today, and I'm talking to Janet du Preez, who's a facilitator, leadership coach, and change designer. So welcome to the show, Janet.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's just really stunning to be with you today.
It's great to have you on, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to be talking about the idea that engagement creates alignment, and I think I've been on both sides of engagement processes where there was definitely a lot of conversation, but somehow it felt quite hollow, and it left things less aligned than before. And so I'm really interested. I think it should be a really, really good one, particularly for anyone who is engaged in change work of any sort. And I think that's a lot of us actually who listen to the show. So that's great.
Yep.
So if you happen to be new to Delightful Dissent, it's a shared exploration that came up from my work with people taking pioneering approaches to complex problems and different approaches to things. Janet is very much one of these people and is engaged with working with people who are also those people, I think, which is doubly interesting. But I found that, a lot of the ideas we kind of take for granted actually don't serve us in every situation, and bringing them to light and looking at the deeper assumptions is a really, really helpful thing. So this show is about challenging some of those and thinking about some things slightly differently. So I hope the show gives you some specific ideas about things that might help you in your professional or personal life around this, perhaps things you can do or perhaps don't have to do anymore. But perhaps more importantly than that, I hope it gives you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge some assumptions yourself. Because I'd like everyone to be able to do this. I'd like this to be a normal part of how we work and how we live our lives. And the show is called Delightful Dissent because, we are disagreeing with the conventional position quite often, but not in a way that's about proving ourselves right at everyone else's expense, and not in a way that's dreadfully serious and difficult. It's really about having some fun whilst we do this and engaging with big things, but in a playful way. The show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if we have any technical difficulties or anything else happens. And this show may be challenging. We may talk about some difficult topics. The most relevant ones to this conversation are likely to be around unpredictability and risk, around marginalization, and around gaslighting and the difficulties that come with that. So if those are difficult for you, then please know that that's something that we might well explore. We may also use strong language. So if that is a challenge or a difficulty for you, then please be warned that that's a possibility. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is about exploring, asking questions of yourself and of others, and really just engaging with whatever comes up for you. If you're watching or live, please do comment and join in. You can, and we will bring in your comments and bring them into the conversation where we can. If you're watching or listening to the recording, then we will be sharing information about how you can get in touch with either of us at the end of the show so that you can carry on the conversation that way. So I first met Janet, I think ultimately through another guest and friend of mine, Margaret Barry, who connected us up and really highlighted quite how similar some of our work was. And I think getting to know Janet a bit and being in some kind of shared workshops and different things, I was really struck by how many rich themes she was exploring, and particularly around complexity and change, and they're things very dear to me and very important to me in my work as well. But also that she does so with a really deeply empathetic human touch. I think sometimes systems stuff can feel quite cold, but Janet's work for me feels very human and very connected. So I really wanted to share what she does with you in the audience. So yeah. So Janet, could I ask you perhaps to introduce yourself and the work you do, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for what you said just now. I think that that's particularly meaningful to me. And nobody's expressed it that way before, so that's wonderful. I live in Johannesburg, South Africa. Would love to be doing more and more international work, but I focus particularly on leadership and organizational development, really understanding the human system, people as human systems, and the systems in which we are a part, and really trying to help individuals, teams, organizations to be more effective. I often say to people, my purpose in life is to make kites fly higher. And that taps into my own strengths profile, but it really is just this awareness that we can always be doing things so much better. So I do a lot of executive leadership coaching, facilitation, and I loved how you phrased that. I think you said change design. I love the process of designing processes and creating those environments. And there's a very fancy word, milieu, a milieu in which transformation can happen. So yeah, that's pretty much me.
Thank you. It's a great word. I think it's more it's a lot more fun than context, which is the one I tend to use all the time. But yeah, no, that's lovely. It's interesting. I was in a conversation yesterday about thinking about this from a games perspective and how we're playing, and the idea of the meta game. Yes. And I think this changing how we change process is a fascinating one. So what is it that brought you to doing this kind of thing? How did you end up doing this kind of work?
Oh, okay, that's a very long story, but I'll give you the short version. I actually started out in life many years ago as a nurse. I did a BSc nursing degree. I always say to people, I learned about the management of a complex dynamic system working in the medical environment. And that route has really pulled its way all the way through all the work that I've done over the years, and more today. I then specialized actually in psychiatric nursing, so I have a very strong psychology background. And yeah, I think really just fell in love with people and understanding what it is that makes people tick and how we can help them to tick more effectively. And then I moved into the business environment and similarly fell in love with business because I discovered that leadership is really just applied psychology. And those three streams have kind of come together in giving me a very, very eclectic, very versatile, and very exciting space to work.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think it's really interesting. Complexity can feel like quite a abstract or hard to grasp thing. And I think, that relationship to medicine as one of the core complexity practices that we know and is a bit more tangible, and to living things and understanding that living things are almost always complex systems by definition, I think. And that's it makes it very relatable as a set of things, and so I think it's a really helpful way in for people to something that can be quite hard to grasp.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, Matthew, just to add, because it kind of relates to our topic, is the question of engagement. So what I have been doing, and you and I've spoken about this, is over the last 6 years, I've actually been doing a master's, which is focused on, the topic was stakeholder engagement in the context of wicked problems. So wicked, complex challenges. And although I kind of honed in on this notion of stakeholder engagement, the concept of engagement has underpinned everything that I've kind of been thinking about over the last 6 years. It's been fascinating.
Super, thank you. So I think we'll get a bit more into the meaning of all of that and how you understand these things in a little bit. But I would just like to pick up on wicked problems, if I may, and to So what is it that makes wicked problems different or special compared to other problems?
Wonderful question. So they are a particular class of problems. And of course, there's lots of theories. Some people don't even like the word. Some people think the word itself is problematic. But they were originally defined in the 1960s. And there was originally in 1973 a set of criterion that classified what wicked problems are. But in the very, very simplest terms, wicked problems are those sticky issues that are just never ever going to go away. They are with us pretty much for life. Some examples: gender-based violence, poverty, educational inequities, climate change, of course, is a big one. The challenge is that because they are so profoundly impactful, we cannot ignore them. So they're never going to go away. We're never going to actually have a solution, highly unlikely, but we cannot ignore them.
Thank you.
In a nutshell.
I think one of the other names that I came across for these in the literature, I think it was Ackoff, calls them messes.
Yes.
And I think that's as a more tangible, like, it's like, oh, this is a mess.
Yes.
I think that's is another way to relate to these things. These
Exactly.
I think of them as very like a tangled, like a big intertangled ball of stuff.
Description.
Yeah.
And in fact, there were three things that really kind of came out in the research, Matthew, that they actually have three distinct qualities. They are always changing. They are highly complex, and there's all these interdependencies within the system. And the really interesting and less obvious one is the amount of conflict that is involved in those challenges. So, yeah.
That's great. And I would I think before we get into this, and I think that conflict part of it is a really interesting one, and definitely something I'd like to come back to. But before we get too into it, have you got a quote that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I do.
Kind of sets things up.
So there could have been lots, but this one was just, yeah, it happened to be in a book that I'm listening to at the moment by Margaret Heffernan, who I think is absolutely magnificent. And the book is called Uncharted. And she said this, and she was talking actually, interestingly, in the context of preparing for pandemics. And I actually keep meaning to check when the book was written, but I think it might have even been before COVID. And she said this: investment today is the only way to guarantee speed tomorrow. Investment today is the only way to guarantee speed tomorrow.
How does that relate for you to what is it that made you want to share that in particular?
So there are a number of things. First of all, that investment word is extremely important when we're talking about engagement. And maybe we can explore that a little bit more deeply just now. It's a very, very vital word. But this concept of speed, I think in many respects, I compare the 20th and 21st century leadership frame, leadership paradigm. Often, I'm doing that a lot at the moment on LinkedIn. Speed is associated with efficiency, and efficiency and speed were very much the sort of rhetoric of, loosely speaking, the last century. How do we do things better, quicker, faster, cheaper? Efficiency was very much the word of the day. And I mean, we've seen over the last few years, as the world is throwing more and more unpredictable, unexpected things at us, we have to respond with speed. But if we're going to do that effectively, we're going to need to look at a whole lot more than just how do we save costs, how do we save time. And what she was really saying there is preemptive, effective engagement on many different levels is necessary if we are going to be able to respond effectively to the big challenges that are coming at us at somehow an increasing speed.
It makes me think, I was reading, I forget who it is who coined the phrase, with respect to wicked problems, actually, of the concept of too urgent to rush.
Yes.
And I think this, this, and for me, it very closely relates. We're talking about problems that don't have a solution in the sense of an end state, where it's not, where those processes aren't happening anymore, or that might, it's that or that isn't a desirable thing. Because if we take it to healthcare, there is one very obvious way to stop disease, but it's not desirable for the individual. It's that, and that we can't kind of then get rid of the problem without getting rid of the system that we're trying to help. So I think it's really interesting, if we get rid of this idea of rushing, like getting to a fixed point. For me, it relates really interestingly to this idea, and often the misapprehension of like, when we're trying to do change, when we're trying to create change, that we essentially, it's like, well, we've done so much already in this direction, we shouldn't change because we're nearly at our goal.
Maybe.
Well, again, if it's a dynamic process, if there's no solution, there isn't really a goal. It's a different thing. So So onto to bring that into the assumption, though, this engagement creates alignment.
Yes.
How does that relate for you? How does the quote and the idea that engagement creates alignment relate for you?
So I guess the first question is, well, does it? And I think and in our preemptive conversation, Matthew, I mean, one of the things that we were exploring was around the fixed ideas that people do have about engagement. An area where I'm very familiar with in terms of engagement is employee engagement. And there are some very, very fixed notions around what that looks like, what it means, what the desirable outcomes are. And I mean, the classic cliche in this space is that we have to engage with people so that they will align with what we are wanting them to do. And they have a very fancy word for that. They call it buy-in. Which I don't particularly like the term, because it tends to have undertones of that efficiency we were talking about just now. What is the least possible effort or investment that we can extend as an organization to get people to do whatever it may be? Interestingly enough, when I first started researching the subject, we were looking for articles that talked about alignment with strategy. And my premise was that as an individual, as an employee, I have a strategy. I have personal goals and objectives that I'm trying to achieve, and the organization has a strategy. And that the more aligned those two are, or the more congruent they are, the more likely it is that we're going to have good engagement. Almost all the articles we found were focused on how do we get employees to align around our strategy? How do we get them to help us do what we want to achieve and to do? So straight off the bat, I question the whole concept. You mentioned in the introduction, Matthew, you mentioned conversation and how engagement so often is about, or perceived to be about, a conversation, which often is one way, just for starters, which is problematic. And this aligns, if we put it into the change context, most change practitioners will tell you that the communication strategy is extremely important. if you want to promote engagement. And again, that communication strategy is usually a one-way conversation. If we just say the right things to people, or we are persuasive enough, or we hold out the right carrot, we will get people to do certain things. And I'm sure it's pretty obvious that those are very problematic concepts.
Yeah, I think that idea of kind of engagement as broadcast, as you know, I see it so often where it's like, oh, if you understand, if I've explained it to you, then you'll be aligned. And therefore, that assumption, the other side of that assumption, is that if you disagree or you raise issues with it, it's a sign of you not having understood.
Absolutely, absolutely, which is a very cognitive perspective. And maybe this is a good moment to just talk about, maybe we'll come back just now to talk about the fact that actually engagement means at least 5 different things. But if we look at it at this moment, or as personal investment, if we're saying we want people to actually invest who they are, bring themselves into a situation, we are physical, social, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual beings. And the notion that engagement is purely intellectual is problematic. So that means that, as you said, if I understand, then I will do. From a psychological perspective, I would suggest that it's far more important for people to believe. And belief is not just, oh, okay, I believe what you said to be true. It's belief at the fundamental level of what is true for me, and not just a truth, but what are the truths that govern the way that I show up. So for me, ideally, if we really want to engage with people, we have to engage on all five areas of personhood. But certainly the intellect is a little bit higher up the pecking order, in a sense, than the belief structure, emotions.
Yeah, I think for me, I tend to think of the underlying beliefs as only really changing through lived experience. You know, as we can think our way into and out of many things, but really that what's in your bones only changes when you experience things in a certain way. And I think that's you know, if our engagement isn't in experience of that very process, it's going to ring hollow. I think for me, when I think of any change effort, if it doesn't have the same qualities, if it doesn't feel more like the place where we are intending to go, how we want it to feel, than the existing state, then something's gone quite wrong with the whole process. It's a real difficulty of, this idea of almost being able to go in the opposite direction in order to bring something about. And I often find that these kind of more cognitive engagement processes have that slightly strange quality of like, well, we'll go through this thing that feels worse and then we'll feel better. Which is a very when we're talking about complex systems, is unlikely to yield the results you expect, because by definition a complex system doesn't behave in fully predictable ways.
And coming back to what you're saying, Matthew, there's a very useful learning framework. Now, for me, learning and change are two sides of the same coin. If I'm going to change, I have to learn. And if I'm going to learn, I've got to change. And there's a really useful framework. It was developed by a guy called David Kolb. And Kolb said that for learning to happen, we actually have to go through 4 phases. And they can happen in any order, but we all have preferences. So my preference is to begin with an experience. Once I've had that experience, I reflect on that experience. So it now becomes something that I'm internalizing, and I'm comparing it with my existing models and frameworks, and maybe tweaking these, redeveloping them. This is kind of what you're saying. Once I've done that, I then go and I test my new theory, which in turn becomes another experience. And so this is what you were actually saying in different ways just now, is that in order for me to become a different person, to show up in a different way, I have to go through all four of those somehow.
Mm.
And maybe this also just touches on why the other part of this whole thing. So in order for me to assimilate and become a different person, there are 5 ways that you can potentially message me through my 5 aspects of my personhood: physical, social, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. And I have 5 senses. And so again, if we come back to this, how do we message? How do we engage people? If all we're doing is sending them an email with a whole lot of information, we're not tapping into very many of these modalities. And they're
So
all
you've hit 1 out of 25 potential modalities.
correct. And we're all receiving messages all of the time. We have our own set of internal messages. And so the challenge of shifting who people are and therefore how they respond is far from simple. But in typical business sense, let's do it efficiently. And the most efficient way is send an email to everybody.
Tell them, yeah, it's that memo thing of like,
Yeah.
you know, it's like, okay, you've told, great. I'd just like to bring in before we get into more of the kind of practical stuff. We've got a question from Linda Dent here, who's asked. I think this is a really great question. Is it possible to get full alignment on any topic? Is there not some level of compromise or negotiated acceptance? So I think getting into what we mean by alignment is also a kind of helpful thing here. Yeah.
Stunning question, Linda. Linda is actually somebody Matthew and I both know. And she and I were in the same room together a week ago, and she asks great questions. So I exactly what you're saying is, what do we even mean by alignment? I think that's a term that people like to use because, again, it's a convenient term. I don't personally believe that it's a reality. I think that it's far more likely that we may get congruence, or we may get a term I really love to use is complementarity, which says that I'm going in this direction, you're going in this direction, but actually the two of us potentially can go in this direction, in our 2 directions together, because there's a complementarity. But no, I don't think the full alignment is actually even a realistic possibility. I love to use this example, and I do it sometimes when I'm facilitating. If you have a group of people in a room, and I say to them, I'm going to give you one word, and in response, I want you to think of another word in response to the word that I give you. And I don't want you to say the word until I give you the go ahead. So 8 people sitting around the table, and I'll use a word like love. Think of a word in response to love. And we go around the table, and of 8 people, if we get 2 that are the same, it's unusual. Usually I get 8 different words: friendship, family, whatever it may be. And that is a simple example of how profoundly different we all are, how differently we actually respond to anything that is happening around us, how differently we perceive anything that is happening to us or around us. No 2 people look at anything through the same lens. So actually alignment's not a realistic possibility. Can we reach some level of consensus or some level of complementarity? Or sure, that's possible. But the more we assume that it's a possibility or that it's going to happen, the more at risk we actually are of it not happening.
It's interesting. I think sometimes I see efforts to kind of guarantee this stuff to make it beyond doubt.
Yeah.
Often do a huge amount of harm to these processes. I think in the gap between what we can know about what people want and what people know that they want, because that's not always a trivial question. There's trust, and if there isn't trust in these processes, that's how we collectively engage with uncertainty. That covers the gap, and I think that really, this idea of I really like that you mentioned complementarity. There's a really important concept I use. It's related to from the work of Dr. Helen Taylor in the UK of complementary cognition, and that we all perceive the world differently, and that is an advantage to how we work collectively. And I think this idea of complementarity around a shared need, a shared goal, we can work in different ways towards a common end for a period of time. We can be fairly confident when we can develop enough confidence to want to do that we can set up a frame. But the idea that, first of all, it's permanent, or second of all, that we necessarily want that goal for exactly the same reasons or bring it about in exactly the same way isn't borne out by any of the evidence, any of the experience. And it feels like, when we talk about alignment, it's like, it feels like this idea of, it makes me think of a very military kind of, like a marching band, or like a march where everyone's exactly in lockstep, and that's what we think, that's a kind of alignment, but it's not the kind of alignment that's going to work in complex and rapidly unfolding environments, to the point at which the military don't use it anymore in any environments where there's actual, where it is complex.
Yes.
So, is that we used to march into battle like that, and the idea that a military would do that now is laughable. And so I think, we're on some level, when we're thinking about alignment, is what do we mean by alignment? What are we handing over to people? Where are we trusting people? I think is a really important part. And perhaps when we think about alignment, is like, where can we feel confident that we are sufficiently aligned that the trust that we do have covers the rest?
So as you're speaking, Matthew, there are lots of thoughts flying through my head. It's kind of the relationship between agreement or alignment, safety and trust. I think that there's a really interesting little triumvirate there that could be explored from a complexity science point of view. What we know is that complex systems, complex environments, highly interdependent, many, often self-governing variables. The rigid, this is the one way in which we do things, works in an ordered system. It does not work in a complex system. And of course, one of the core or the key responses to complex challenges is the notion of experimentation, which you were alluding to. This idea that we could try 3 or 4 different approaches because there is no one right way. And that just because you and I don't agree doesn't mean that both of us may not be partly right. That's one of the sort of challenges that I think has been very much at play again over the last sort of century, where we've had this notion of best practice. There is one.
I was just about to bring that in.
And it simply is not valid and it is not true. But I wanted to pick up on what you said about trust. And for me, trust is very closely aligned with the notion of safety. So we know that from a sort of at a very, very simple level, from a neuroscience perspective, we are attracted to things that are rewarding, and we are cautious of anything that is potentially going to be detrimental or threatening to us. And so that ties very much into this idea of trust, because trust is, it's a massive, massive, massive subject. We had a long debate about this actually in another workshop I was part of last week. But if we bring that back sort of full circle into the engagement conversation, engagement and trust are very closely aligned concepts. Because engagement, if I view engagement, one of the meanings of engagement is investment. So in order for me to invest myself physically, socially, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, there are two things that need to happen. The first is that I don't want to do that if I'm going to get a negative kickback or a negative response for doing that. So if it's threatening, I am likely to withhold my investment. If, on the other hand, I'm potentially going to get a good return on my investment, whatever that return might look like, and again, your return might be physical, social, emotional, intellectual, or spiritual, then there is a greater chance that I will actually bring myself in and commit my personal resources into an effort or whatever it may be. And so that notion, trust, I guess, in that sense, is about the perception of reward versus threat.
And I think what's interesting for me really starts being a real, one of the kind of almost an assumption within the assumption is the directionality of these processes, is the way that trust flows, that everything flows through this process. Engagement creates alignment comes from the idea of change happening top down.
Yeah.
And it's partially true, but it's partially true. And missing the bottom up processes is really a lot of what I think is happening. It's that, like, okay, this is what it looks like from the top.
Yeah.
It looks different from the bottom, and there's important information there.
Yeah.
And I think for me, particularly as, and this relates very strongly to the complementarity, is that we all have different perceptions. We all have different things we want and things we don't want, opportunities and threats, essentially.
Yeah.
And a big part of developing trust is the acceptance that those are real and valid, even if we don't share them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think for me, what we're doing when we're really engaging is establishing this mutuality, this overlap, where we do have a shared frame of experience. We have a shared truth, however long that may last and in whatever context, but we have that for that time. And, to think of that, this process is creating a shared truth through that all contribute to, is a really important part of this. And I think on the flip side, it means that if you are responsible for leading some form of change, you don't have to have all the answers ahead of time. You don't have to think for other people. You can engage with it on your own level. And I think, freeing people from the idea of best practice, that there is a single optimal way of achieving any of this, is one of the huge things. So you don't have to worry about best practice. You can look, I often talk about effective practice in complexity, is that you can't even have good practice in complexity. You just have effective practice. So the question is, what's the effect? Is that something we want?
Yes. Yes.
And So it's all that, is that, and is that something we want now? Is that a thing we want to happen now? Or is that something we might want later on? Or is that something we don't think we were going to want? But this idea of seeking and demonstrating to others that there is this flawless, perfect process actually gets in the way. And I think particularly if we feel, and completely understandably as leaders, because a lot of the discourse around leadership and the ideas around leadership are in this direction, that we need to have all the answers, and actually even that we need to have all the relevant questions, because that's a really important part of this for me as well, is when we're talking about different perceptions, it's the different questions. It's like, what are all the questions and what are all our answers? And I think this whole process, and it's also right back to what you were saying at the beginning, another thing we don't have to worry about is a fixed end state. It makes sense to pick like a way marker, a milepost, but it's going to carry on changing.
Exactly. And I think, Matthew, that was what was so interesting doing the research in the space that I was doing it in, because by looking at wicked problems, which cross boundaries, where actually there is no de facto authority, where the problem is not going to be solved, made this a very, very interesting space to think about. So what if you do not have a designated authority? What if there is nobody who is in charge, who is going to be responsible for engagement? We all become responsible for engagement. Now, people will take the leadership role on. Well, what does that look like and what does that mean? But if we're talking about poverty, for example, who's the person or who are the people or who's the group that says, let's talk about poverty, which does pose challenges in and of itself. And it really highlighted the power dynamics that actually often happen in relation to engagement, which is another whole subject. Another thing that kind of flowed out of that conversation was the importance of feedback. But I'm going to come back to feedback, because one of the meanings of engagement that I don't feel has been well explored at all, certainly not in employee context, certainly not necessarily even in the context of these big multi-system engagements, is the notion of engagement as a process over time. So I mentioned there were 5 different meanings of the word. You're getting the second one now. The second one is that engagement is a process over time. And there are 3 critical activities that happen in that process. I'm going to start with the end, because the end is action. That's the last activity. Well, I say it's last. It's an iterative cycle. We go through the cycle over and over and over again, but we get to action. Before we get to action, we have to get to intention. This is when we're looking for alignment. We're looking for what can we agree on. And this is where we're kind of saying, okay, well, some of you think that will work. Go off, go and try that. Some of you think that will work. Go off and go try that. But the first part of the process is connection. And this comes back to what Margaret Heffernan said: investment today is the only way to guarantee speed tomorrow. Because we don't invest enough time in making the connections. And connection is not simply we've just had a conversation. When I talk about connection, I'm talking about connection at every possible level of the system. It's talking about connecting with the past, with the present, with the future. It's talking about connecting with the people, connecting with the problem, connecting with the resources. It's talking about connecting with myself, with what's going on inside of me and my experience of this particular challenge. So connection is a profoundly rich concept that I think, for the most part, we do very, very badly. if I look at what Margaret was saying around this investment concept, and she's talking in the context of being prepared for a global pandemic, she says relationships should have been established years ahead of time. It's the old Boy Scout motto of being prepared. And she distinguishes between being prepared and planning. And she's saying, and we know in a complex context, planning breaks down because we cannot plan for all the eventualities. But can we have a prepared system, a system that knows how to think, a system that is relational? How do we build that to help us to deal with these huge complex challenges that we are facing and are going to continue to face?
I think it's a really important distinction to make. It feels like the difference between, for me, strategy is what we're talking about when we're talking in complexity and we're talking about wicked problems. And so often what I see is people using tactics, not strategy. And I think it feels very related. The plan is like, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. And instead of, again, this is like not having to have a solution ahead of time. It's like, this is what we think might work. How can we find that out? And some of finding that out is talking and finding what other people think, and some is and then it's experimenting. But it's an ongoing discovery process. And I think I would like to, just as we're kind of so starting to wrap it up, but I'd really like to bring in this question from Linda, because I'd like to see if we can get something slightly more, give a bit of a practical example, because this can be, I know how difficult this can be, quite an abstract topic. So Linda asks, how can you apply these ideas to the wicked problem of archaic school systems, many of which still apply the one truth classroom top-down approach to education? So
let us at it. I think if there was one area, I'm very passionate about educational transformation, and I have to say, Linda, I don't have all the answers. In fact, I have very few answers. I have a lot of questions. But if we had to apply that framework of saying, well, first and foremost, how do we shift the connections? How do we get different voices in the room? How do we connect with different questions? How do we, I'm kind of running out of blank, but reconnecting. If we want to shift the system, we have to form different connections. We have to cross some boundaries. I think that education is absolutely ripe for not a radical envisioning or a radical overhaul, but for wildly crazy experiments.
I think for me, I almost entirely agree, and I think the context, one of the big contexts to cross here, is between education, schooling, and work, what we do. There's a loose relationship at best, and one of the challenges of, when we're talking about this engagement creates alignment as an assumption, is essentially that the organization, or at least its leadership, don't have anything to learn. They don't have anything further to learn. And I think this idea of, how we can become curious, how we can develop the skills to really engage with uncertainty effectively, because I don't believe I think those of us who, for whatever reason, have kind of landed on having a highly developed set of skills in this area, it's feels a little bit magical to some other people. And that has problems. I think being willing to engage in this space, one of the reasons it's so scary for people is because they don't have many tools to do it. particularly actually leadership positions. Often they've never been given the opportunity to develop this. And I think for me, spending some resources on developing the general case, the stuff around the problem, right where we started, the how we change, how we learn to learn, is absolutely a core part of this, and it happens across the entire human life cycle for me.
I think one of the really important things, and this is going to come back to this question of trust, and let's add safety into that conversation. One of the reasons that education, I think, is proving so difficult to shift is because it feels terribly scary to shift it. We have a system that supposedly works.
It does a thing. It has an effect.
But there's so much invested in that system. There is so much rooted to that system. What if we change something and it's disastrous? What is the cost going to be if we get this wrong? And I think that that's a huge part of this whole picture. And I mean, really, Linda, in response to your question, until we shift the way that we think and what we believe about education, we won't shift education. There are lots of wonderful experiments happening, and I think it's going to be from the fringes. I think that education will be disrupted in the same way that so many other industries have been disrupted, but it's not going to happen from the core.
I think for me, it's what does it mean to be led by the learners? What does it mean to engage on that level? And when I look at the human-centered models or child-centered models of education,
yes,
it's very interesting how many adults who experience child-centered education end up launching and running very big, successful tech companies.
Yep.
So this fear, is an interesting one. And I think one of the emotional parts of the whole alignment thing is understanding whose fear it is. Where in the system is the fear? Because children aren't scared of this until they're taught to be.
No. Absolutely.
It reminds me of, there's this famous thing around like a lot of the fairy tales that are too scary for children are actually too scary for adults, and children really enjoy them.
Yes.
Roald Dahl is usually given as the archetype, but the grim fairy tale, is that the children aren't scared of those. It's so whose fear is it, and therefore what is that fear telling them, and what can they do with it instead of being able to pass it on? And I think this understanding, we have different perceptions and we have a common stake, is a really important part of how we work with this. And for me, the idea of change. I also, for me, the other side of this is to get away from the idea that we need to know what that change looks like.
And maybe just jumping in on that, Matthew, is I think one of the greatest challenges to change in the world is experts. If we think about it from a creativity perspective, now I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't have expertise. I do believe that that's of great value, but I think that creative solutions and innovative solutions often come from non-experts, and we have suffered over again the last sort of however long with this idea that people had to stay within their disciplinary boundaries within their age boundaries. I mean, for goodness sake, don't ask a child how to develop a better education system. You know, so we've got to get more interdisciplinary, more transdisciplinary, more trans everything if we possibly can, because the more different perspectives we get onto any challenge, the more likely it is we're going to actually come up with an innovative solution. But expertise actually roots us in our old best practices.
I think for me, there's there's a fundamental value in expertise. And for me, it is simply that because of the recent historical preference for top-down process, it has been overused. So it's of high value, but it's just in diminishing returns.
Yeah. And if it is the only voice.
That, yeah, exactly. And for me, it's an important voice.
Yes.
And the aspect of lived experience is another really important one. For me, and in my own work and my own personal exploration of this, there's something fundamentally interesting in individuals who are both experts and have lived experience, which is a very challenging area. You know, there's something deeply paradoxical about that very often.
Yes.
And how we engage with that, you know, and surfacing those people and working from that context is a really important one. I think this idea of how we can bring in to the whole process, all aspects of the process, the design and the development as an ongoing effort. We're never gonna align permanently. We're never gonna stay engaged permanently. It's a dynamic, ongoing process. And I think for me, this rethinking it in those terms is like, what if this never ended? Is a really, really helpful one. What if education never ended?
Yeah. Yeah. Please let it never end. I had a thought, just a last thought around this notion of expertise. It's gone, doesn't matter.
I think for me, you also mentioned interdisciplinarity, which I think is another really interesting one. This relationship between what it is to see things from two different models, two different modes of thought, two different approaches, and the value of interdisciplinary practitioners to the breadth of the field, as well as the value of single disciplinary specialists to the depth of the field.
That's exactly what it was, Matthew. What I was going to say is we need to stop thinking that we're going to see anything through a lens of knowledge or through absolute knowledge. We need to start looking at things through different lenses. The more different lenses we apply to a challenge, the more likely it is we're going to see useful things, see things differently, and potentially come up with different solutions.
And I think to loop it back around to the quote you shared at the beginning, that is uses some resources, and that is as sound an investment as anyone could make.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I think there's so much there, and I think I'd really like to kind of invite people to follow on this conversation, because I feel like we've only just touched the surface in particular, and there's a lot more practical that I would like to bring in at some point, but we haven't had the chance to do so. However, if people would like to get in touch with you, we've shared your website and your LinkedIn in the show notes. Is there anything specific or any specific ways you'd like people to get in touch with, or conversations you'd like to have, or anything you're planning or working on that people might like to know about?
Super. Thanks, Matthew. Top of mind right now is working imminently releasing a new leader development program, which we call the Astute Leader Program. And it really is focusing on what leadership needs to look like in the 21st century. If people are interested in my thoughts around that, I'm posting a lot on LinkedIn at the moment, just trying to draw some contrasts, looking at shifting paradigms. So that's certainly something and there is information on the website around that program. We are doing a bit of work at the moment. And in fact, you mentioned Margaret earlier. We're doing some work around helping people to reconnect in this era that we don't even know what to call, because we can't call it post-COVID. So what is this era? But as people are reconnecting, reassembling, and getting ready to react going forward, we are putting workshops together to help teams to come back together in whatever form that looks. And then I'm always eager to have conversations around how we might apply what I've learned in the research to real juicy, big, important social challenges. I love facilitating and designing those kind of processes. So always eager to have that conversation.
Thank you. And I think for me, to really join up some of those things is for those working to address significant social challenges, is how vital it is to make sure that you have the representation of those with lived experience in those challenges.
Yeah.
And to connect with my work around neurodiversity and mental health, that is so vitally important. And I'm very gratified to see that there are a number of projects starting to do that, but that whatever you are seeking to bring about to help others, make sure they're involved.
Yes. Yes.
Properly
yes,
involved. Yes. Even if you're just changing things for you're a leader and changing things for the employees in your workplace.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
It's so important. So thank you. We mentioned a couple of different resources and different things. I wanted to share quickly off the top of my head. Yeah, there's the Complementary Cognition by Dr. Helen Taylor, and I think there's a website. I think she has a website called complementarycognition.co.uk if you're interested in finding more. On Margaret Heffernan, some great books, but also, if I remember rightly, a couple of really good TEDx talks.
Brilliant.
Or TED talks. So if you and I think to distill these ideas, TED is a format that does a thing, and distilling ideas is one of the things it's very good at. So to get a really clear sense of some of the stuff we've been talking about, I'd really recommend checking some of those out. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of resources or anything?
Maybe just one of my a publishing partnership that I have deep respect for is Robert Keegan. And I can never remember her first name, but her surname is Leahy. Keegan and Leahy, two amazing books. One is called Immunity to Change, and the other one is called An Everyone Culture. Fabulous books have definitely informed my thinking a lot. Many others I could mention, but those two particularly.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah. So I want to thank you just for being on the show and for such a really interesting exploration. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation today and feel like we could explore this topic much further.
Absolutely. So thank you, Matthew. It's been really a great privilege to be here, and thanks for amazing questions and stunning points that you put in. Just make the conversation flow.
You're more than welcome, and I really do thank you all for watching in the audience as well. It's absolutely your support that lets me do this or legitimizes my excuse to have these really wonderful conversations with fascinating and lovely people. You can find upcoming and past episodes on YouTube and LinkedIn and on your favorite podcast platform. Though at time of recording, I'm still behind in getting the back episodes up, though that is getting ever closer. So I hope to get that resolved very soon. And Delightful Dissent is taking a short break, partly whilst I do that, and to give me some more time to concentrate on getting the technical things sorted out without more backlog. And we're going to be back in the autumn with some more really exciting conversations. So I very much hope to see you when we resume. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thank you and goodbye.